Hello. Hello to everyone. Thank you for joining us, for you all joining today. First, I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves in a moment. Look, may I start by thanking the organisers, specifically Dr. Sheila Robinson, for kindly inviting the three of us to speak on this panel at this important global event. Secondly, can I thank you all online for taking the time out of your busy schedules to help us to listen and help us increase our collective awareness about the importance of all aspects of diversity, equity, inclusion. Okay, so what are we going to do on this panel? Look, we're going to hope to try and delve into some of the pivotal aspects of genuine and true diverse representation in the mining industry. We intend to hopefully explore the intersection of race, ethnicity, gender, going beyond the usual sort of D&I discourse and practices to specifically identify how ethnic and racial representation contributes to future-proofing the sort of the whole of the industry's workforce. Look, it may be a sensitive subject for many, so we're going to have to discuss terms like racism, which many people don't want to do. So I think today we're going to get a little bit comfortable being uncomfortable if we are to create and embrace the change that we all want and have a more inclusive workforce. I'm sure we're going to have some authentic and courageous conversations. Just wanted to start by saying one of the challenges the three of us had when we were talking about this panel is just definitions. Black, people of color, white, indigenous, Asian, Latinx, marginalized, minorities, and then all the acronyms, BIPOC, BAME, all of which are acceptable to some and not acceptable to others. So if you'll forgive us today, we're going to sidestep that discussion and we hope not to offend anyone. But instead, we're going to try and strive to examine the unique challenges and opportunities faced by racialized people from sites to corporate offices across the global industry. And hopefully between the three of us, we can contribute some insights. So quickly, who am I? I'm a son, a father, a grandfather, a husband, born in the UK, now live in Toronto. Currently the Chief Sustainability Officer for Resource Capital Funds, 30 years in the mining industry as a consultant and an operator, and now the in-house lead in an investment company. And I've gained wonderful experience talking to the previous speaker. I've worked in over 50 countries and truly gained a lot of cultural insights that way. I'm passionate about D&I, and I'm a proud member of the International Women Advisory Board. So look, throughout my career, I've struggled to work in an environment where there's always been limited representation of folks who look like me. And the higher up the ranks they got, the less there were. So representation has always mattered to me for my entire career, especially as I got older. But worldviews have really changed. So I would like to start by sort of asking both of you, perhaps starting with you, Barbara, and then to Bothwell, after you introduce yourself, what does representation mean to both of you? Barbara, take it away.
Hi, Kevin. Thank you for a great introduction. And hello to the audience. I'm Barbara Dishinger, Director of IWiM, a global nonprofit focused on making the mining sector more inclusive. I'm based in London and I identify as Brazilian, which confuses a lot of people, and happy to talk about identity there as well. Each time we host meetings at IWiM, events or conversations, we try to ensure that we have different voices around the table, which for us includes people of different gender, ethnicity, race, age, etc. And we are prepared to organize and go ahead with one less person or two, or to add more to avoid an all-white panel or everyone of the same sex. We will not go ahead. This topic really resonates and matters to us. So rather than definitions of race and acronyms, I'd rather go into the definition a little bit of intersectionality instead. Intersectionality is an analytical framework for understanding how individuals' various social and political identities result in unique combinations of discrimination and privilege. Intersectionality identifies multiple factors of advantage and disadvantage. Examples of these factors include gender, sex, race, ethnicity, class, caste, sexuality, religion, ability, and neurodivergence, socioeconomic backgrounds, and age, to name a few. These social identities intersect and overlap, making us all beautifully us and unique. Apologies for the doorbell, I will not answer it. Intersectionality plays a crucial role in diversity within mining. And it's essential to recognize that challenges vary for individuals at the intersections of race, gender, and other identities. Intersectionality provides diversity of thought and perspectives, which allows for better decision-making and better risk management. And for us, this is essential. Diverse teams foster innovation, creativity, and productivity, and efficiency in organizations. Bothwell, what does representation mean to you personally and in your professional role?
Hi, Barbara, thanks very much. And hi, Kevin, thanks for introducing the topic. My name is Bothwell Mazarura. I am based in Johannesburg in South Africa, so it's now in the afternoon where I am. So I'd just like to say, I will say good day to everyone because I know we are all over the world. I am Zimbabwean by birth and spent most of my early life in that country. I am an accountant by profession and spent most of my early working life working for a professional accounting firm in Zimbabwe. I did some work in the UK as well and ended up in Johannesburg, South Africa. And then I transitioned into the mining industry, which I've been in for the last about 14 years or so. I work for Anglo American, specifically their iron ore business called Kumba Iron Ore, which is based here in South Africa. And I'm the Chief Financial Officer of Kumba Iron Ore. I recently also joined the governance board of IWiM. So Barbara, whatever she saw in me, kindly invited me to be part of the organization. I am passionate about issues of diversity and inclusion. And I am passionate about women in mining in particular, because that's a particular area we need to address. So it was a good fit to be able to join Barbara and the team and strive to further the cause. In terms of just representation, I think for me, you know, and you'll find through this conversation, I like to tell stories. So the best way I think about representation, I guess, is the way someone once explained to me diversity and inclusion. And the way that was explained was, you know, diversity is about inviting everyone to the party and making sure you invite all sorts of different types of people to a party so that you are in a room and it's now filled with different types of people. But they may not feel included. There's lots of things happening at the party. There's the bar, there's the dance floor. And then, so what is inclusion then? Inclusion is when you're not only just invited to the party, but you are asked to dance. You're invited onto the dance floor to dance. So now you are included in the activities of the party. So that's inclusion. But again, that's not enough. When you're invited to dance, you are not compelled to dance the way everybody else is dancing. You're not compelled to dance in the same style. You're actually free to dance whichever way you want. Let your head down, be who you want to be. And for me, that's about now being authentic and bringing your true self to the party and being completely included. So for me, representation is about making sure we look at the breadth of whatever demographic, whatever country we are in, and make sure that we have diverse people in the room, but we are including them, we're inviting them onto the dance floor, and they can be who they want to be. So that anyone who comes and watches that or sees that someone posts on social media about the party, they can say, right, I can relate, I could see people who look like me, and I want to be at that party. So for me, that's what representation means, Kevin and Barbara. Let me just, I guess, move on in terms of looking at what else we should be touching on here. I guess. Kevin, from your experience, how can the mining industry ensure that the voices of ethnically diverse people are heard while championing for the diversity within the sector?
Great question, Bothwell. I like to see you and me letting our hair down on the dance floor. That's going to be a good one. Look, let me start by saying the term colorblind is often used to describe the declaration that someone simply does not see color. And many people who are not aware of and would vehemently deny having any racist tendencies unwittingly engage in this colorblindness. Although this is not intentional, disregarding race and ethnicity, reinforces the status quo and that imbalance of power. Fact is, race is very emotional and sensitive topic. As I said earlier, people are generally uncomfortable just hearing the word racism, and I'm going to use it a lot today, so I'm sorry. For people seeking to understand others' racism or their own, it can be difficult to know where to turn to. Many non-racialized folks really reticent to talk about racial inequality in the workplace because they fear saying the wrong thing. But we in the mining industry must adopt a more open mindset, I think, and try and attempt to empathize with others' feelings and attitude. I think the previous speaker mentioned this. Look, some people talk about mentorship program. That's how we're going to change things. And these programs are incredibly important, but what is even more lacking is sponsorship if we are serious about championing diversity, equity, inclusion. So many ethnic diverse peoples will talk about being mentored forever, which can, I'm afraid, sometimes become code for sort of patronizing and condescending coaching, usually with helping these certain people change certain cultural characteristics. You know, you're too passionate or something similar. Why can't you be more like so-and-so? And generally, we think we know what's best for your people. Those are the things that come out in some mentoring programs. So we've got to be careful that it's mentoring and sponsorship. Another challenge is many D&I leaders in the industry are still white, and they often struggle to appreciate other forms of diversity. So it tends to get neglected and denied. So as leaders, we have to stop playing the ignorant card when it comes to racism and other forms of discrimination like homophobia in our industry, as many people just don't want to hear these words. But I think as leaders, to answer your question, we have to get comfortable being uncomfortable. Leaders have to stop talking and really take time to listen, which is hard. Probably I suggest to a lot of the leaders, listen to your kids, because that's a good start, as their generation is much more attuned to social justice than our generations. And we need help to recognize the biases we have learned throughout our careers. We've all learned them throughout our careers, especially in the mining industry. And that really do stop us from becoming those inclusive leaders we all claim to be or want to be. So we have to take that time to stop. And fundamentally, what I'm trying to say here is ethnically diverse peoples can't be heard, to answer your question, until leaders actively listen.
No, that's great, Kevin. Some great perspectives coming out of you there. Barbara, I guess from your perspective and about the state of representation, you know, what specific challenges have you observed or experienced, particularly in terms of diversity in leadership and the general lack of data and research?
That's a great question, but I did love Kevin's sort of points. So a lot to take away, and hopefully everybody will take that on and be happy to be uncomfortable, not just today, but going forward as well. So ethnic representation in mining varies globally, everywhere. Mining is very context specific. However, we can say what we observe is that globally leadership diversity remains a really big challenge. We have seen so mostly we see male white leaders at the top of mining companies. We see less male leaders of other ethnicities and races, and we see even less sort of women and even less women of color. We have seen an increase of women on mining boards, however, hardly any progress at all when it comes to women in senior leadership, executive committees, and in CEO roles, which is very alarming. There are much more, and also definitely less white women. We see then less and less of them on boards and in executive senior leaderships. However, South Africa is a notable exception because legislation is in place to guarantee ethnic representation, and Bothwell will tell us more about that later. So I would say that there are two large items. So first, we need to ask ourselves very hard questions, which are how can company boards and investors promote diversity and inclusivity in the mining industry by making these measures strategic and compulsory for this to become intentional, right? What can we do to push an increase of women at senior leadership level globally in the next 5 years? Secondly, to best understand and address the challenges and barriers, more data, unfortunately, is needed and has to be collected. There isn't a lot of data, say, especially not deep diving into each aspect of intersectionality. That makes it even harder. For example, how do we measure productivity of diversity against homogeneous teams, for example? So as to the data that is collected, when it is tabulated separately for women and men, organizations have the possibility of more accurately assessing differences in the situations of each sex on several social and economic dimensions, right? But when you disaggregate the data by sex, it is possible to build gender statistics that reflect gender roles, relations, and inequalities in society. However, when that gender data is not available, it opens the door for general and generic assumptions, as well as shortcuts, preventing the accurate assessments of situations. Furthermore, the ability to measure, preempt, and respond to challenges is hindered when data is unavailable, which undermines the design of effective responses to impacts. So if the large-scale mining sector is to contribute to the achievement of SDG 5 on gender equality and SDG 8 on decent work, it is necessary to address these data and analytical gaps. Some of the barriers and data gaps that remain are that, for example, not all countries and/or all companies collect or have sex disaggregated statistical information. Not all collected data is made publicly available. Some countries don't allow data collection on certain characteristics, be that on sex or sexuality, for example, or religion, to cite a few. Another limitation observed in data sets concerns the definition of sex and gender, which are not exactly the same thing. In all countries we know, with the exception of Canada, for example, the data collected and represented in national statistics is disaggregated by sex, meaning binary, men on one side and women on the other, right? But it's not sensitive to measuring trans or non-binary persons, making it impossible to develop fully inclusive public and corporate policies, which is needed. And the world needs to understand that, we've moved on from just the binary sort of side of things. In addition to this, publicly available data on workplace discrimination and harassment is largely invisible, as mining companies do not report these incidents in sustainability reports. So a lot of work on data remains to be done so that we can sort of have more information to understand where the problems lie and prepare better solutions going forward. So Bothwell, what is the current state of racial representation in the mining industry in South Africa? And what specific challenges have you observed or experienced, particularly in terms of diversity and leadership positions?
Thank you, Barbara. I liked your conversation around data and obviously collecting data. Being an accountant myself, I love data, and I always say that the numbers don't lie. And the more data we have at our disposal, the better we are able to analyze and come up with solutions for some of the matters that we are discussing. I think, as you rightly say, in South Africa, I guess that's less of a problem because, as many people know, South Africa does have a challenging past in terms of race relations, given the apartheid era that the country went through. And at the dawn of democracy in 1994, I think South Africa moved very quickly to put in place legislation to try and address the inequalities of the past. We typically call it BEE legislation here, which is, but it's actually got 3 B's in it and then 2 E's, which talks to broad-based Black economic empowerment. And it looks to, I guess, level the playing field by putting in place specific targets and specific measures. And the reason why it's called broad-based, also it recognizes that it's not just about leadership positions or board positions in a company. It's about participation of a majority in the broader economy where they were not allowed to participate fully in the past. And I think the mining industry clearly is not immune to this. And if anything, the mining industry may have played quite a central role in advancing the previous regime that was there and exploiting cheap labor of the majority in that country. So what specific industries have gone on to do on the back of the legislation is come up with what we call charters that are specific to each industry, that are specific to address specific issues in each of the industries. And we've got our own mining charter, which looks at all resources companies. And it sets out targets. And we've gone through a couple of iterations of the mining charter here in South Africa. But what it does is it lays out targets across a broad spectrum of areas, including representation at an executive level, at a board level, in management, in the core areas of mining, for example. But then it goes on to talk about companies' investment in education, companies' investment in procurement from local businesses, and so on. So it's quite a broad charter trying to address a broad range of issues. And we have seen progress. I mean, if you look at all the statistics around, the numbers, representation of women on boards, in executive committees, we've seen significant progress. In our own company, for example, in Kumba, my CEO is a Black female lady. We've got others on our executive committee, our head of human resources or people and organization, as we call it now, our head of safety, sustainability and environment is also female. So we've seen significant progress since this legislation was put in place. But I think, as anything, once you start to legislate something, it always comes with its own unintended consequences, right? So you, Barbara, you ask about some of the challenges. And I think some of these challenges we see is, I guess, people questioning credentials or competence of leaders in particular who are of color, in terms of how they got there, whether it was just because we needed to make up the numbers or whether they're actually really good at what they do. So you get those challenges, and none more stark we had in our country than when you look at sporting teams, because similar things happen to our sporting teams, especially in the sports where representation of Black people historically just wasn't there, like rugby, for instance. And then players of color who played in the national rugby team began being given the label quota players, like they're just there because they're Black and they can't really play the game. So, you've got to rise above such challenges and such unintended consequences and try and understand that we are trying to address a broader problem, and it's a problem that still exists, although we've made significant progress. But also to realize as you go along, you are going to learn, and that's why we've gone through a couple of iterations of the mining charter, as well as the legislation itself. And it's about learning as you go along, and as things improve, then the focus starts to move perhaps to other areas as we go along. So we're by no means there as a country. We've got a long way to go. But certainly the measures that we put in place through legislation, but also what we are doing in business and as companies is helping us get to where we want to be. So it's a journey and we will continue to work through it. I've spoken enough about South Africa. Kevin, it'll be good to get your view. You've worked in a lot of countries, as you say. I mean, what is your view about ethnic representation in the mining industry globally, and also what are the challenges that you have seen or experienced, particularly in terms of diversity in leadership?
Thanks, Bothwell. I love the point about rugby. I remember the days when the South African and Springboks box were all white, and now watching the World Cup now, it's wonderful to see that, and in other teams, but particularly with the Springboks. Yeah, breaking news or not, look, outside of South Africa where things have had to happen and needed to happen, the mining sector is still predominantly led by white males. It's an established club. The idea of racism in our industry is consistently denied, whilst companies including BHP, Rio Tinto, Goldfields, and others have exposed the truth about, sexism, discrimination, and other forms. So it's there. But the problem is a lot of these things have become normalized in a lot of companies, and these companies that have come, talked about this openly are definitely not unique. And a lot of other companies pointing fingers saying, look at them, but all companies really are struggling with this. I think the problem is, I agree with Barbara, we need data, but I think the data is also going to tell us what we already know. We need the data because it backs up and helps the decision makers, but we already know there are issues. And yes, there are, with a few notable exceptions, where women or racialized employees have risen to the top and feel they belong, but these are still far too rare, and we quote them as examples rather than being the norm. Some companies are genuine in their D&I commitments, others less so. I think for companies, for some continue to just tick the box with D&I. It's a PR exercise, whilst quietly protecting the status quo for the privileged few in power. It's not surprising also that gender has been the primary focus, and rightly so. But regrettably for many companies, I think this has resulted in a sort of myopic attitude of just looking to attract a few token privileged straight white women into senior roles. Sorry to be so blunt. Some also believe it begins and ends here, so that other forms of diversity are simply not relevant to their company. And I've seen this personally in companies that I've been working with or gone to, that they sort of stop at a certain point. In my experience, it really depends on the board and executive. If they genuinely care, then things happen. Otherwise, simply it does become lip service and tokenism. As I said, we don't need expensive studies, although we do need the data and piles of statistics to know that racialized LGBTQ+ representation is routinely considered far less important. And this underscores the real challenges that such marginalized and racialized people face. And I think progress towards true diversification and inclusivity will only come about when there is a shift in the mindsets of our leaders and a deeper understanding of all forms of diversity. Look, he asked about globally. I think we've got to recognize that the mining industry has a long history of racism, especially in settler countries like Australia, Canada, the US, and of course, South Africa, which were all rooted in colonialism. In Canada and Australia in particular, mining sort of policies that were clearly racist have had a lasting effect on Indigenous people and land ownership, as well as their economic and cultural practices. We are still facing that today in Canada and Australia as well. And despite what many claim, racial discrimination continues today. It's exemplified by one example I can give you, the concept that we use of expats, who still for many, when you use the word expats, tends to mean a white male deemed essential to manage local or Indigenous employees. And that it's a word to some people, but it does tend to have connotations for some people. Look, racism and negative cultural stereotypes have become normalized, from casual slurs to a lack of hiring and progression and promotion for racialized employees. So doing nothing in the face of the status quo of racial inequality is essentially supporting the status quo. So look, our mining industry, we've come some way, but we cannot claim, we can't be an innocent bystander, and we need to be more than just not racist. We need to learn as an industry, and leaders have to start of actually being anti-racist, looking at our systems, the policies, where we work and how we work if we want to tackle this. I think I'll stop there. Let me ask you then, Bothwell, if that's okay. In your view, when professionals can't see someone that they can relate to identify with on an ethnic or gender basis among their leaders, do you think they have a greater difficulty themselves reaching those leadership positions? What's been your experience?
It's a great question, Kevin. And one of the things I've also heard as I've gone along is that you can't be what you can't see. And I think certainly if you can't see representation at the highest level, it's very difficult to aspire to want to get there, right? So that's the first thing. And one of the stories I like to tell is of my daughters, and if I told their story to them now, they would cringe because they're now 19 years old and starting university. But back when they were 3 or 4 years old and starting out at nursery school, We obviously took the decision to take them to a private school, very highly regarded. But I guess what we didn't do our research in terms of representation at this school, especially in the nursery school. And the school goes all the way up to high school. And the issue is that at the nursery school, there were no Black teachers in the class. In fact, the only Black people that my daughters saw typically tended to be either classroom assistants or young interns from university, but never the substantive teacher in any of the classes. And we were oblivious to this, my wife and I, until one day my daughters came and they asked the question, Mom, Dad, can Black people also become teachers? Because to them, they thought only white people can become teachers, because all the Black people they saw were not teachers. And that's when it hit us. And of course, we took them out of that school and also challenged the school about representation. But for me, it just emphasizes the fact that it's very difficult to aspire to be what you can't see. And generally, people even start boxing themselves away from certain careers or certain industries because they just don't see themselves represented. Mining is particular to that, especially when it comes to women, still regarded as a very male-dominated industry. Women are not safe in mining and some of the areas. Therefore, you then get women not choosing mining careers because of that respect. So it is absolutely important for people to see someone that they can relate to or identify with in an organization or in an industry that they aspire to be in or aspire to succeed in. And I think for me, that just opens the door, I guess, for people to find good role models, to find mentors, to find people who sponsor them, which is all that we need, I guess, as people to be successful and to be able to gain confidence as we aspire for leadership positions. And this can also, I guess, it's about building trust in organizations, right, which is really key from a productivity perspective, but it also helps us retain the talent and the diverse talent, as well as attract more talent into to But absolutely, you do need to see someone that you can relate to or identify with to even have the ambition to get there. Kevin, I don't know whether you see it differently from your experiences.
No, I love what you said there. I think it's such a wonderful statement you made there. And I think, as you said, we've got to look at the leadership of our mining companies. I think the CEO of Mining Association of Canada, they've come out with a new diversity, equity, inclusion toolkit. And I think when they announced it, he said he was quoted of saying that the industry was male-dominated and homogeneously white. There is that acknowledgement there, so it's very important. But when we discuss these sort of things, not in this sort of crowd here, but you quite often get the response, but Kevin, I hear you, but there are not enough qualified women or racialized candidates. How many times have I heard that? And then I hear the second bit is usually, well, Kevin, we need to hire the best candidate for the job, just as we have always done, not this senseless tokenism. Now, if I could write that on a t-shirt, it'd be a big t-shirt, but the amount of times I've heard that, relying on that deeply rooted myth of meritocracy, that is one of the challenges we face. So beside what you mentioned about being able to see, it's also the way we recruit into the industry. The fact is that a lot of senior leaders in recruitment, they tend to recruit and promote people similar to themselves. And this perpetuates the problem. We know this, particularly in the mining industry and at corporate and sites, it's always, we needed that person yesterday. We got to rush. We've got to do this. In addition, as I've mentioned earlier, gender diversity itself does not necessarily lead to other forms of diversity. We need them all. And that's why becoming anti-racist, becoming anti-phobic is equally essential if we truly want to have that inclusive and equitable workplace in the mining industry for everyone. This is so important, but it continues to be ignored by most mining leaders who solely focus on one aspect of D&I. Another problem, I think, that is that many deliberately choose to focus on representation at boards and executives because it's visible, it's easily managed, and it looks nice when you put your ESG reports out. Meanwhile, impacts on local communities and the local workforce, the people working on the mine sites, tends to be ignored. And that's where you have bit more diversity. And that's where there are problems that we've seen big companies, but even other companies having problems on remote mine sites where issues of racism, sexism are really bad. Remember, everything we are talking about will really be a worthless exercise if people from underrepresented groups simply don't feel valued and comfortable at work. And that's why the inclusion, the belonging you mentioned earlier, is critical. And that creation of that psychological safety for all employees is important. I think, as I've said earlier, and I keep saying it, racism and all these things is an emotional sensitive topic. It really stirs a multitude of emotions, and why we deliberately avoid the subject. I found that when most people think about the issues of this, they tend to think of examples between individuals, like, oh, sexism and racism is just two people not getting on, or the extreme of white supremacism, for example, in North America, rather than it being about the way institutions and companies have policies and practices that create barriers for people to get promoted, to be retained, and to rise up the ranks.
No, great insights, Kevin.
Sorry,
Barbara,
Bothwell, I just wanted to add two things. You asked me about the difficulty. Sorry, just 3 points. For racialized people, they generally, in theory, have to work harder than their peers, as they don't enjoy the presumption of competence afforded to white males in particular. They have to keep earning it throughout their careers. Secondly, racialized folks have to constantly code switch. That is, to fit into the dominant cultures as a way of sort of self-protection, safety, and judgment from microaggressions. This is emotionally challenging and exhausting, because you don't feel safe. It's your dancing thing. They don't feel safe. And lastly, I'll quickly say, they're also tired of being the diversity voice. And then when they are, they're accused of being angry and aggressive if they dare to speak up. So those are some of the challenges that they racialized people face as they do rise up. Sorry, Barbara.
Yeah, no, thanks, Kevin. You've got a lot to say on the subject, but I know so does Barbara, and I'm pretty sure she's got something to add to this. Barbara?
Yeah, no, I love both your vulnerable stories and lots of important points that really matter. I would just add a few little things just to complement. Senior leaders, which we know are mostly white in mining, recruit and promote people similar to themselves, right? Which perpetuates this issue that we're discussing today. But we can't forget that this can also locally apply to Asian and or Black men who then exclude other ethnicities or exclude women and or indigenous people as well. So basically the dominant group excluding others and not sharing privilege, which sometimes is just human behavior, although it's not the best behavior. Also, there is a lack of, as you've explained, there is a lack of role models, right? And this affects not just achieving, right, the senior leadership role, but even if you made it to a leadership position, we heard from a number of women from different ethnicities that it can be hard to relate to the others when you're not the typical person in the room, and especially when you're the only other. So whilst personally they have the drive and the ability to pursue a successful career, at times they question themselves whether the effort makes sense, right? Whether it's realistic, whether they should aim that high, since there is no one that they can identify with on an either ethnic or gender basis next to them. Mentors and mentoring programs, as well as sponsorship programs, also there's very few of those, and policies that actively promote diverse talent into leadership roles tend to address these disparities and are therefore important and a step right towards a solution. One of the objectives of our global mentoring program, IWMP, is to reduce cross-cultural barriers in the mining sector, which we achieve by matching mentees and mentors from different countries wherever possible. Kevin has been a mentor on the program, so when he next takes the microphone, maybe he can share the different nationalities or places his mentees have been from. But I would like to sort of also remind everybody that it is not a level playing field. There are existing barriers and difficulties which we need to try and empathize or understand. So there is the inferiority complex that lots of people and racialized people have due to centuries of colonialism, which prevented their confidence, assertiveness, and ambition. They have had lack of education access, discrimination and racism, less opportunities, experience, and exposure in their life, which altogether creates some of these situations where they feel like they need to work double as hard, and that they have to code switch, as Kevin was saying. Bothwell, to move on, as we want to go through a lot of things still, and we know that time's running away from us. So what are practical applications that you have seen work or use yourself to be actively more inclusive towards people of color and gender minority team members?
No, thanks for that, Barbara. I think earlier it was you who used the word intentional or deliberate. So I think as organizations, as leaders, we have to be intentional and we have to be deliberate about it. And that means putting in place specific measures, whether it's targeted recruitment processes to address the underrepresented categories, having specific focused development plans and succession plans for talented individuals, increasing the intakes of and deliberately so, of female or non-white candidates, whether it's for straight into the organization or even for programs. A lot of mining companies have got bursary programs and programs that they run to be able to attract talent into the business. So for me, we have to be deliberate in those programs. And you talk about mentoring, and I know IWiM is big in terms of its mentoring program. At Anglo American, we also had a mentoring program, which we actually called it reciprocal mentoring. And it was about leaders mentoring someone who was different to them, whether it's a different gender, a different race, or just a different age or a different background. And we called it reciprocal because it was clear that we also wanted leaders to learn from their mentees. It wasn't a one-way mentorship program. And in fact, as we got feedback from the program, most of the learning actually came from the leaders, learning from the experiences of the young people coming into the business and the problems or the barriers that they had faced in terms of trying to make it in an industry or in a world where they were not as represented perhaps as their other counterparts. So for me, it's really about being deliberate. Kevin, I don't know how you believe we can attract and retain more racially diverse people.
Lovely question again. Just to answer Barbara's when she said, I've been on the IWiM program a long time, and I'm so proud I've learned so much from it, but I have had the privilege of mentoring somebody from Ghana, from Madagascar, from Macedonia, and my current one is South African. Interestingly, dynamic in South Africa. She's a white South African working in KwaZulu-Natal, and some challenges she faced there, difficulties. So very interesting dynamic. Look, to get to your question, our industry is not immune. We know that. Our history in mining, our institutions, the businesses, the cultures makes it almost impossible not for our industry to inadvertently support prejudices and that institutional racism and sexism. So if we want to recruit and retain more racially diverse people, I believe we must start with the assumption that everybody has internalized negative stereotypes. It's impossible. But I don't want leaders to take this on personally or use this discomfort as an excuse to disengage, because we all need to talk about this. I think feelings of guilt or defensiveness are common responses, but ultimately they're counterproductive. We can overcome racism and sexism in several ways, and I believe honesty is the best place to start, because denial just perpetuates the problem. But our industry does, as you said, have to move beyond the sort of flowery rhetoric on discrimination and just, the plus 8 things. And we need to ask companies, are they truly fighting racism and sexism, ableism, or homophobia? Just talk about it. So talk about recruiting. How do we remove discrimination from the recruiting, hiring, and talent processes? We all know our industry is facing a great talent shortage. There's so many articles about it. So I think companies need to stay vigilant about the protocols and promote the consideration of looking at marginalized or racialized groups whenever they need to staff up, and it's usually quickly. I'd really encourage them to take a really good look at your sort of talent pipeline and overhaul their talent processes to remove sort of latent discrimination practices. For example, when recruiting at predominantly white institutions, they need to seek out organizations that represent racialized students. Companies should build relationships and networks that represent emerging leaders, marginalized and racialist groups. For example, in Canada here, we have got a BIPOC recruitment agency that's focused on that to help people. I think they've got to commit to diverse internships, fellowships, secondment programs, as you said, and the number of intern hires should have some quotas on them. So we're looking at that diverse group there. They also have to implement bias interrupters in their hiring policies to ensure marginalized and racialized groups do not suffer from discrimination. I would love to see more people doing blind recruitment on the CVs and take out names, because that straight away, names and all those things do inadvertently stop some people going even to the process of getting an interview. They need to look at their interview processes as well. Who are their recruiters? How do they do their performance practices, compensation structures? Really examine this under the microscope. Even things like dress code, I have to say, including hairstyles and religious symbols, dreadlocks, hijabs, turbans, because these do matter if you want to have a diverse workforce, because these are barriers, real or perceived, to professional advancement. Remember that some of these perceptions about appropriate dress codes or appropriate hairstyles or symbols are rooted in historic racist attitudes. So we need to overcome those. And these all together will hopefully help us hire and retain a more diverse workforce. I think on that, I was just going to, and I'm going to be fast on this one. I think we wanted to talk about, the issue, and I think I brought it up already, about microaggressions and that unconscious bias that we use. So firstly, I think many people don't know what a microaggression is, or simply chuckle when the term is used. I've seen it so many times, and that's one of the biggest problems. They think that it's political correctness, or in North America, it's being woke. Look, it's about a respect for workplace behavior and well-being. Often when racialized folks mention microaggressions, they're usually met with a barrage of comments and behaviors and being labeled troublesome, being told, "Oh, I don't see color, I'm colorblind. You're always playing the race card. Sex and racism isn't as bad as it used to be. It's a joke. You've got a chip on your shoulder. You're overreacting." I could go on. The fact is that racialized folks experience both verbal and behavioral microaggressions, stereotyping, conscious and unconscious implicit biases daily. This undermines inclusivity and ultimately the desire to create that belonging that Bothwell, you mentioned right at the beginning. Often the aggressors don't realize they've crossed a line by generally showing that insensitivity to someone's biases of gender, sexual orientation, class, race, or whatever, and they don't really do it. And diverse employees are often not appreciated for what makes them different within a corporate sort of culture. And we tend to impose these one-dimensional worldview corporate cultures, thinking that's the only way to do it. And that demonstrates that lack of cultural competency. Sorry, I can't say it. Cross-cultural competency. Look, anyone who's worked in the mining sector will know that comments have become normalized. So we've got to make sure we stop this. And I think the best way to do that is, again, by listening to other people, reading and sharing resources. It's not going to be easy. And again, we've got to look at training, but I've got to be careful, and I want to be quick on this one. Unconscious bias training is not as great as people say. Even Harvard had done studies. It's okay, but it's not the best type of training to really make sustained and meaningful behavior changes. We've got to increase awareness, and we've got to be more direct discussing sexism, homophobia, racism, and allyship. I think that's how we've got to do it, emphasizing respectful treatment, interrupting privilege, protecting comforts, building intercultural intelligence and communication skills. That's how we're going to overcome things like microaggression.
Thanks, Kevin, for sharing your points on that. And I always sense your passion And I wish we had a magic wand and the industry would already be there, or that we could do more faster. So hopefully our listeners today will join we will become a little army that can move this forward. In my view, it's all about educating ourselves that we may not all look the same, but we all are the same. So we may come from different cultural and ethnic backgrounds, but we all have chosen this sector to work in for a reason or another, or lots of us have fallen into mining by mistake and end up being really passionate about the sector. Therefore, respecting one another as humans and working together is what will help us get rid of the biases and the discriminations and lots of the barriers. Often we are not aware that we are biased towards something or someone until we're made aware by that person or another person or a situation. So continuously educating ourselves and people around us about unconscious bias, about all of these sort of old barriers, new barriers, and people's experiences are key to achieve respect at work. To combat microaggressions, the industry should implement diversity training of some sort. They are not the only thing. They need to come with a big package of other things to enhance workplace inclusivity. We know that embedding unconscious bias training doesn't really work very well, or training in itself is not enough, right? And it's very hard to embed, as Kevin was saying. So maybe adding an accountability process to it, or a point system, so that if you get bad points, well, you just have to do the training again, or something that includes accountability would be something that people need to adopt. We do think that bystander training programs can be very useful because they're very practical as well. Creating a safe space for reporting incidents is also absolutely crucial because, and also the onus or the emphasis not to be on the survivor or on the person who things have happened to until proven that they've happened, but for companies to have more empathy and better systems when it comes to that. We also suggest that we need environments where everybody feels safe to speak up, right? And everybody role models that everyone is valued. One way of achieving that is very easy, a little bit like the previous speaker was talking about, everybody telling their stories over lunch. You could also create culture days where everyone shares foods and traditions so that everyone feels that they belong. And the majority group learns about other cultures and everybody's religious festivals or any other global days of observance are sort of celebrated, creating a bit of a family. Most importantly, though, we need to get back to absolute basics. If the mining industry is serious about championing inclusion, then they need to start from the foundations of companies. Mining companies need to change their value statements to ensure that inclusion is clearly stated in it, embody and live those values, and everybody holding each other accountable within the company. Bothwell, you are a male leader and an effective ally. How do you promote diversity, equity, and inclusion within your organization and the industry as a whole? And how do you suggest others behave to achieve this goal?
No, thank you. Thank you for that, Barbara. And I spoke about the mining industry not being perceived as a safe place, especially for women. And one of the things that I have put up my hand for within our organization is to be a champion and an ally in terms of diversity and inclusion, and especially around the cause of women. Now, one of the things that we experience in South Africa and indeed in our industry across the globe is a lot of bullying and harassment, especially of women. And then more specifically, and I think this is more specifically a South African problem, but not to say it doesn't happen across the world as well, is gender-based violence. And this is whether it's domestic or it happens in the communities or it happens in the workplace. So for me and for us as an organization, we've taken a deliberate stance that we want to create safe working places for women. So I have put up my hand in our organization to be the champion in the fight to eradicate gender-based violence. And for me, it's really, it's an imperative for us. If we can do everything and we can sing everything we want, but if people don't feel safe in a particular environment, then you can do whatever you want, but you're not going to attract people into that environment. And I think my involvement as a male is particularly important here because males are predominantly by far the perpetrators of these actions, whether it's bullying and harassment or gender-based violence. And we then need to stand up and hold each other accountable in terms of bringing people to account and making sure that we lead the fight to get rid of this scourge. So one of the things I started a couple of years ago, especially during COVID, when this particular problem started coming up or rearing its head more predominantly from a South African perspective, was to start conversations with men within the business. And these are conversations about men coming together, being vulnerable, talking about the issues, and giving men a platform to talk about these issues and air their thoughts. And then what we then did was we did what we call industrial theater, where we played back these conversations and what we had picked up across the organization. And some of the things we picked up, were quite disturbing. And we then realized we had to get into a more deliberate campaign around bringing people and creating spaces for people to be able to speak up. And one of the things we then did within the organization was creating what we call a Living with Dignity hub. And this is really a hub that's a safe place for females and males who want to speak up and report things that are happening in the organization or that have happened to them without victimization, but it also then provides support to victims as well. And we have found that this is working quite well, and we are starting to at least unearth some of the things that are happening and bring them to the fore, because then we can do something about them and we can deal with them. So for me, I think generally as leaders, and people often look at me and think, oh, but you're a CFO, you should be concerned with financial things. But for me, we don't create value if we don't create safe spaces for all our people and for diverse people. So it's absolutely imperative, and it's completely aligned in terms of our view to create value. And we don't do that if we don't have diverse workplaces. So Barbara, those are some of the things that I am doing, and what we're trying to do as an organization. I know we've been given a bit more time, but I still do want to maybe leave a few minutes at the end to be able to deal with the questions. So maybe Kevin, in terms of best practice and solutions, and this is now around culture, and I know different organizations have got different cultures. But our company culture is workable, and how do we create a more inclusive culture throughout operations and head offices?
Great question, Bothwell. I like your point there about we don't create value unless we're making sure everyone feels belonging. That's great. I think really getting clarity around this whole complex issue, this multi-layered issue of diversity and inclusion, is the first step and probably the most critical step to developing an authentic culture. It has to be based on facts, not assumptions or what another company did, or just quotas. Otherwise, you're not going to create that culture. In fact, I think we all need to work hard to recognize and respect the facts and overcome that all too acknowledgement barrier when we're about to embark on a D&I strategy to change the culture. That acknowledgement is usually one of the hardest. As I've said, no leader in our industry can claim to be an innocent bystander. Changing culture has to start with, and I think we all know this, excuse me, the leadership's willingness to conduct a probing assessment to identify how some of their long-standing practices may unfairly or generally does stigmatize women or racialize employees, and how it has reflected in their workplaces, both at the corporate and mine sites. Some of these ways tend to be blatantly obvious. Some are blind spots, implicit bias we talked about microaggressions. That's why it's important. So where I've seen a good cultural change, I've seen companies start by conducting what's generally called a state inclusivity assessment. This often gets skipped and they go straight to training or something else. But until you understand where they are, and an honest assessment of where you are compared to where you think you are is so important, both as a company and individuals. I think this assessment will differ depending on geography, local demographics, and differing worldviews, but I've seen it being the fundamental way to start any sort of cultural change in D&I. And then I suggest you've got to start by training the leaders, as tone from the top is the most critical piece of cultural change. You can't just do it bottom up. Then perhaps, as I said, once you've done that assessment, start talking to other management and the frontline employees to understand how they're really feeling. I think throughout the process, companies must ensure they create that safe space you talked about, Bothwell and Barbara, that psychological safety, that everybody can be part of the conversation without any reprisals. Boards must also listen and encourage others to listen. And I've used that a long time about listening. They can't assume that their role in their company or their title gives them a better view. In fact, it's the opposite. I found the higher up you go, the less cognizant you become of the real challenges on the ground. It's that famous iceberg of ignorance that you get that you really don't know when you're in sort of the ivy towers or the corporate towers. So take time to listen. And to truly nurture that sort of belonging culture, companies need to prepare for that uncomfortable reality check. There goes that word again. And, avoid the all too common default of defensiveness or denial when they get the feedback from doing an assessment, because they won't like what they hear, but it's important to hear it to move forward. And if they don't do anything in the face of the inequity that we're all seeing, they're supporting the status quo. So again, remaining passive is no longer an option for companies. Engaging in difficult and uncomfortable conversations on sexism, racism, ableism is the new expectation for mining leaders at all levels if they want to have this cultural shift and attract more talent. It's perfectly normal for all leadership to feel completely overwhelmed and uncomfortable again when you're going to go about these cultural changes. But getting uncomfortable is where we got to start. And acknowledging these areas of weakness is really the first step. So look, as leaders, if we want to be inclusive, change the culture, we've got to take time to show up, listen, reflect, and really move forward. And I think that's the best way. And leaders won't have all the answers straight away, but as long as they show to their employees they're willing to learn, they're willing to listen, and they want to fix them, that's a great way to make the first change on your cultural journey.
Barbara, do you have anything to add to that?
I would just compliment to what Kevin was saying, that this is not something for once a year. This requires amazing intentional effort and accountability every day. And it requires a complete overhaul, right? It also, of every single process, everything, everything needs to be looked at, right? It also includes the workspace, not just the behaviors, but also how things are arranged, the layout of things. It also includes shifts and how they're designed. It includes everything. And so this doesn't work without a budget, a plan, and a dedicated team. So ideally, companies shouldn't just assign this to somebody who already has a full-time job and sort of say, you do that on top. Thank you very much, because you really care about this. This is great, but then they are sort of set up to fail, which I don't think is the right way around. And in the same way as, our children are a reflection in a way of ourselves, and they parrot and mimic what they see, the general tone for the organizational culture is set by those who are in senior leadership roles, as Kevin was sort of saying. So as such, it's crucial for company boards and executive committees, but also all the levels below, at every level of organization, for everybody to be dedicated to this sort of cause of a better sort of organizational culture, and to lead by example. And then, yes, it is workable, it is possible, but it requires a lot of effort. do we have time for the next question, or should we move towards wrap up, Sheila?
I think you should move towards wrap up and give everyone a chance to give their last remarks. Kevin, Bothwell, Barbara, you've been amazing. Thank you so much. But I think you are at the 11:35 mark, and that will give the three of you a chance to summarize your thoughts on this panel and leave us with your final thoughts. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So Kevin and Bothwell, do you want to say a few things, or are you happy for me to summarize?
Yeah, no, look, I think just to say, Kevin, Barbara, great conversation that we've been having. And I'm sure if Sheila had given us more time, we could have carried on for a couple of hours. It is an important conversation to have, though. But as we've been saying throughout, we need to be a lot more deliberate. It's one thing having the conversations, but we do need to put the actions in place, and especially from the leaders in an organization, it really does start with us. So for me, yes, let's continue to have the conversation, but let's also act decisively and intentionally to deal with the issues that we have. That'll be all I want to close with.
Bob, I'll be even more succinct. I think I've said it many times. As leaders, this is about leaders in the industry, and we're leaders at all levels. It's not just leaders at the top, it's leaders at all levels in the industry. Get used to being uncomfortable. And number two, listen. We can't create the change unless you listen. If you come to the table with all the answers, we're never going to be able to have a cultural shift or understand other people's perspective. So practice your listening skills to help us move forward. Thank you.
Well, we've had a great conversation, and we do go on for hours about this. So we'll hand over very soon. So we'd like really to maybe just summarize a few points, or give you, if you take nothing else away, just remember that what we all have in common, and on this call, all of you and in the world, is that we are people. And we need to sometimes forget about the various backgrounds and experiences or accents of others, and just think of one another as human beings, to relate and to care. And when we care, we can open our eyes to the privileges we hold and to properly see the disparities others face, and then we can focus on action. So remember that representation matters, right? And inclusion matters, especially when it comes to people of color and women, and when it comes to positions of power and leadership. Intersectionality provides diversity of thought and better decision making, and men need to be proactive allies who listen first and are empathic second to their female colleagues and or underrepresented groups in the workplace. So I would like to leave you with one action point, which is the act and the gift of reflection. Look at your current environment and assess where you are, including acknowledging your lack of knowledge and your own unconscious biases. Become self-aware, curious, ask questions to your colleagues, start conversation, and train your empathy muscle. And from a corporate perspective, do evaluate the corporate culture at your end. Do assessments, as Kevin was suggesting. If you're an employee and you get one of those surveys about the status of your company, don't just spin it. This is the time to speak up and your voice to be heard. Otherwise, nothing will ever change. Question current policies and procedures, and especially think, what can you do to make a difference? So thank you very much to all of you. We've had a great time. And thank you to Sheila for putting up this amazing conference once more. And I can't wait to now hear Dr. Brad Jensen and Dr. David Smith talk about their wonderful topic as well, which is always good.